even start our panel right now, even without my questions. So I'm very appreciated to be here. It is a big pleasure to have such an honorable guest in our panel. My name is Jacek Rau. I'm from Defense24. I'm generally a security and defense specialist and also cooperating with WEA. And today we'll have a great opportunity to talk not maybe only about the security background of present situation, but I would like to see more debate about the momentum which might provide a better approach to understand our European relations and European security architecture based not only on this military aspects. So first of all, I would like to present our panelists, Aleš Alhnović, Gunnar Hökmark, Julia Tyszkiska, and Richard Zundrist. It is a great pleasure to have you here. So my first question, general to you, do we have a kind of a momentum in our European history in which we can define that we need to have a new Europe for the new years when we are looking at the situation with Russia, with their invasion? Do you think that we can create a new security architecture based on our own values, European values, or we can only refresh something from the Cold War, like NATO, like this debate about the transatlantic cooperation? Moreover, I would like to ask you, do we need to redefine Europe? Is it necessary to have something new? Because there's a large debate right now that we need to have something new, something based on European values. Do you think that's only an emotional approach to war in 21st century?
Do we need to redefine Europe? I think maybe we need to define Europe. When I was thinking about this panel, I was thinking about all the different Europes that we have. We have a geographic Europe. We have a European Union. In this context, obviously, we're talking about NATO, which is partially European and partially not. You've got neutral countries in Europe. You have a security architecture. You have plans for a European army. You've got we're all speaking English, but the major English-speaking country has just, quote-unquote, left Europe. So what Europe are we actually talking about? When I first came here, or when Ronald Reagan hanging on the wall, there was a divide through Europe called the Iron Curtain, and when he said, you know, what can we do to stop that? And it was what the previous panels were already talking about. It was military on the one side. It was income from oil and gas prices on the others. I am a firm believer that if in the 1980s oil prices had not been so extremely low and the West was able to basically outspend in an arm race in the Cold War the Soviet Union, which just couldn't keep up, that maybe events would have been totally different, because Russia is still a heavily energy-dependent economy, and a lot of the sanctions that happened will definitely bite. I just did a little bit of back-of-the-envelope mathematics. Russia spends a lot on military spending. Germany has just pledged 100 billion euros extra spending and to increase its military spending to 2% of GDP. You want to do the numbers? Russia spends 65 billion on its military a year. 2% of German GDP is 77 billion.
And we need to also understand
And if we looked at just EU GDP, we are talking about over 300 billion, which is close to 5 times what Russia spent, and this is only the EU. So if you wanted to outspend on an economic thing, because, you know, despite all the criticism, Europe is still rich. Why is it rich? Because of capitalism. Everybody hates that. But, you know, we're basically rich. I've never understood why all these rich countries, the third, fourth, and fifth richest country on the planet, can't afford to defend themselves. Somehow you want to coordinate that.
And there is, I think, one remark necessary to put here. Definitely we need to understand that there is a Russian standard of arms modernization, because 10% or 20% is going into the army. 80%, as we see right now, is going outside army. So when we compare these numbers with European, with Germany, or with NATO members, this division is, I think, much bigger in numbers, because in Germany, in France, I don't know, in the United States, there is no chance to so many money leaked out by corruption in military. So we still watching this old type of modernization in Russia. This new is full of corruption.
Yes, I think you can say that a lot of the Russian defense spending is visible in palaces around the Mediterranean. And it has proved, I mean, most people are surprised by the lack of efficiency in the Russian military forces. Doesn't mean that they are not forceful, which is another way which is important to remember, is an extremely force with a high level of capital for violence that they're using and sacrificing a lot. But I still would say that this is a time when Europe is redefined. I think Europe is a lot of different things, of course, different countries, which it shall be, but also a common identity, which you can describe in different manners. But I think that threats are normally always a defining factor. And these threats have been emerging for a long time. Russia, a lot of people have been open-minded and seen that. A lot of others have looked away, or it was more comfortable to look away. China, let us not forget China, which is not only a rival, it's a hostile actor trying to undermine democracies and European security, as well as other parts of the world. But this is redefining us, and I think that what we have seen is a number of very rapid decisions and actions that at least Putin was surprised about it. And I think most citizens in Europe have also been surprised about it, what we could achieve, and what we can do in order to support. And I think in some way it has surprised us all, that we could mobilize all these. And this creates a new, stronger identity, because the old European paradigm, that was to create peace between European countries. Now this is about safeguarding peace for Europe. This is more external, while it was more internal. But this also means that we have to look up for the global identity. And for me, this is a momentum to also secure that we make Europe strong by looking upon the global perspective rather than trying to regulate and create uniformity. It's a difference between different political directions that we can choose between, and it's very clear. So I think we are in a redefining moment.
But do you think that with right now NATO policy toward this conflict, we can afford to build NATO in the middle of this redefinition of Europe and this transatlantic, but also in global approach, or we need to have something new, like European ideas of our own independency or our own armed forces? Do you think that we need to have something new?
I don't like the phrases of strategic sovereignty or strategic autonomy. I prefer strategic capacity and strategic capabilities and strategic alliances. And what we have seen now is that we can be strong mainly when we had the strategic alliance with US. US and European Union, US and Europe. We need them in order to deal with Russia. They do need us and will need us in order to deal with China. It's a common problem, but it's a shift in the geographical paradigm in this sense. So we need each other, and that's why we need to level up our capabilities, not in order to walk alone, but in order to walk together with others. And that's a shift. When you talk about NATO, then we talk about the over level, so to say, in a conflict, the military conflict. But what we tend to forget is that in the gray zone, the conflicts and the war has been going on for quite a long time. The energy policies of Putin has been one way. Disinformation, destabilization, corruption, murdering people, etc. So we have to be strong all the way. And what I think we have seen is that we were not so organized on those levels, which mainly will be an European Union task, as we were up on this level. And if we're not organized here, then the risk is that you have an escalation along the steps up here to the military conflict, which is in some way what we have seen.
Julia, do you think that we need to redefine Europe right now?
Maybe I will start with just one step back. So, as you already know, my name is Julia. Mainly, like always, I live in Kiev. But just a few days before war, I took my 3 kids, who are 2, 4, and 6. I took them to Lviv, just because I really felt that something will happen. Also took some pieces of art, which were important for me. And on a day 4, I had to take my kids and leave the country. My husband stayed. He is in Ukraine. He managed a big network of volunteers, or 600 volunteers who evacuate people from hot places in Ukraine, who works with refugees on the border. So in my normal life, I got like my NGO I was leading. We had Bendukiza Free Market Center, which was promoting freedom for many years. My like life within libertarian community started like 15 years ago. I was the first organizing with my colleagues liberty camps in Ukraine. And 12 years ago, together with Martin, I participated in this Atlas Leadership Academy. So just a year ago, I started my first entrepreneurial steps. So we founded a startup. So I had quite a normal, like quite a successful life there. And just one day, we had to leave everything and leave the country. And now we are based for 3 weeks already in Vienna, just because we spent like 4 weeks traveling from country to country with my kids, simply being not able to find a place to stay. And sitting here today, it's quite confusing for me, because I was like, I know Minister of Defense well, so we were in touch. We were doing different things from the big day 1 of war. Gathering hackers, like receiving 3 tons of chicken needed to deliver to some cities, like each almost Ukrainian now can procure bulletproof vests, and we know the whole levels, etc. But you know, sitting here today, being quite confused, wearing a jacket, knowing that so many Ukrainians are. Just an hour ago, I received a air raid sirens alarm that I need to go to the shelter, being in Kiev, if I were there. So I feel confusion, especially after a previous panel. And I have an answer today for all of us. So what is the answer of our libertarian community to this war? We are like, what I'm reading, what I'm hearing, we are calculating taxes, expenditure of taxes. Seriously, guys, I'm representing Bendukiza Free Market Center. And Bendukiza talked to us many times that freedom is not about taxes. It's about people. It's about dignity of people. It's about Bucha. It's about Irpin. It's not just about governments defending their own citizens. And we should not pay, like, lose 5% of economic growth. I'm sorry for being emotional. But we are fighting for freedom and dignity. And it's a pain, after so many years being within classical liberal community, not to see any answer. It's a shame.
And it's a big frustration for me personally. And I was the one who was working after Maidan was Minister of Economy in Ukraine, bringing Kakha Bandukidze to consult us how to deregulate economy. And we deregulated many things. And we implemented a lot of market reforms. And we proved by our resilience last 2 months that we are the society who are entrepreneurial in each task. And we do everything we could each moment to defend the values, because values, it's not about declarations. It's nice to sit here and talk about freedom, and it's happy to be free. But it's a bit different when your husband had to do military training because he probably in 2 or 3 weeks we need to fight, and you have 3 small kids. And it's different when a mother of my administrative director, her head was separated from the body in Volnovakha because the city was 23% demolished from the air after they were not able to fight us on the ground, because people without any arms were defending their land, were defending their freedom. That's why I believe that values, it's not about declarations. It's not about sitting here and saying oh, it's happy, we should be free, in some books. It's about actions. And I do think it's a momentum for Europe now. And I do feel a big appreciation and gratitude to all countries, all people who understand that, who stand with Ukraine, who understand that it's not about Ukraine, that this war is not about Ukraine. This war is about Europe's peace. It's about values. It's about freedom of the world. And I'm really grateful that there are a lot of us. And me, changing these places, just trying to find another place to stay with the kids, because for me, that was also inside. During Revolution Dignity, I was fighting on a front line, being just on ground, and it was a great experience being with the people. But now, as a mother, I understood that I need to take care of future generations. I need to take care of my kids first. And it's such a big, it's so valuable to meet all the people. In Austria, after the Minister of Foreign Affairs saying probably Ukraine should find another option than European Union. Seriously, who proved the values of European values? I would say human values, and fight for human values more than Ukraine now. I'm sorry for taking this longer time, but my question to all of us is, what is the response to this war of libertarian community, of classical liberal community, of Koch Industries who are doing business in Russia, which taxes are collected to sponsor arms which are killing our kids, soldiers who are raping kids and women? What is our position? Where are we standing for? Calculating taxes? 2% of taxes? Thank you.
Thank you, Raj.
I came from Belarus, and I can only support Yulia, because something that right now is happening in Ukraine, it started on a different scale, obviously, but it started in Belarus 2 years ago, when Lukashenko suppressed, at first rigged the elections, and then put pressure, high pressure, on unprecedented scale on the society. The only country that actively supported him was Russia. And unfortunately, the response of the international society was too slow, uncoordinated, and rather symbolic than real. First, sanctions, or first sorts of pressure on the regime were personal sanctions, so very symbolic. Then were some economic sanctions, but not on the key enterprises or key sectors of the economy, but rather on enterprises that are not dealing with the EU or the West, so it was hilarious. Then there were some important sanctions, but for the regime it was very easy to avoid them via either different countries or via some false business entities and so on and so forth. So if if Europe will not redefine or find the solution how to deal with such ugly dictators like Putin or Lukashenko, these stories will sooner or later happen also in the EU or in some other neighboring countries. So it's important, and as Julia also said, Ukraine is right now fighting not only for Ukraine, but actually for European values, so for all of us. And this is actually why many Belarusians are also fighting hand in hand with the Ukrainians inside Ukraine, both as military volunteers, both as doctors, as some other volunteers who are supporting Belarusian diaspora, is collecting money to send weapons or cars or some other medical stuff and so on. So I can only agree with Julia that it's really important to stand together with Ukraine. It's not about money. And actually, even if we talk about money, there are quite a lot of estimations that even, for example, even if Germany, I'm just mentioning Germany as the one of the country that is hesitating whether to use more pressure on Russia or not. So even if Germany will stop importing Russian oil and gas, the recession in Germany will be around 3% of GDP. So it's like normal recession during normal economic crisis. It's not like something disastrous or a second great war and so on and so forth. So for many countries in Europe, it's sacrifices, but not like the sacrifices that Ukraine, for example, right now is paying. And if we will not find these answers, so it will repeat sooner or later in our homes, our countries.
Do you think?
May I say one thing about this? Because I think we need an understanding that the war goes on in Ukraine, but it is a war against us. And this is a war about Europe. And I must say, I don't think you can say that there is a libertarian or a conservative or a socialist approach to some questions. I define myself more like a liberal or whatever. I don't think it's very important how I define myself anyway. But I think when you have the evilness in front of you, then you have to fight it. And then you have to make the sacrifices or you have to make the spending. I don't think you shall lock yourself in a debate about taxes. Then you are losing perspective. Because freedom, overall freedom, is of another paradigm than the ideas of how we in a peaceful society, in a free society, can develop policies. And then you need to take the special effort. When there is a fire in the forest, you can't discuss if you are going to deal with it in a libertarian way or in a socialist way.
We need to act.
You need to act. And you need to act as sensible as you can. Because it's an urgency. And that's why I can understand your reaction. This is a defining moment in the sense that we need to define and decide what do we want Europe to be able to do. And then we can discuss the policies inside of that direction.
Due to this, I would like to ask you about these sanctions, because from military side, I can define that we are changing on very good path our approach to support Ukraine. There is a large debate about in our military and security society about this new wave of tanks, APCs, and new military equipment provided to Ukrainian defense forces. But in Europe, in Poland, there is still, I think, a lot of question marks about the sanctions and the role of sanctions against Russia. Is it effective, or how to create this effective structure? Is economy a true pressure on Russia right now? What do you think?
Well, sanctions have a long history, and sometimes they work, but very, very often they don't. I was actually surprised by some of the very strong economic sanctions that had been taken and the way they were taken. Because obviously, Mr. Putin had prepared for economic sanctions in a certain degree by building up Russian foreign reserves and by building up Russia's gold position and by putting himself in with various trade deals. So then to freeze Russian funds, which was very, very, very unexpected in the catalog of functions, to withdraw, well, there were two things. There were the sanctions as such, and then there were the measures taken to try to prevent the Russians from circumventing the sanctions. Because if you levy sanctions, then there's always some way around it. And the Russian economy, you can sell oil from A to B, you can sell it to the Chinese, you can use the yuan, but to cut off, and you saw it as a great surprise. The ruble fell immediately, fell extremely fast, and then you had the sanctions package that was meant to prevent the Russian central bank from intervening to support the ruble. And that worked. But then all of a sudden the ruble recovered to a certain extent. The ruble in the exchange markets. And that is how they're using it. How can they get funds for what they were doing? Because we are continuing to make payments. The gas are flowing, and some, and very, very many European companies have decided no longer to do business there. That's the way it works, but the sanctions were extremely selective. The ultimate sanction has not been done. Would possibly be to cut off the energy deals in total and prevent it. Would the Russian economy immediately collapse? No, they have reserves to do it, but in my opinion, or my hope, is that of course the Russian people would notice the sanction and would learn more about what is going on, because it's an information, it's a propaganda campaign. So will sanctions ultimately work? I'm not sure, but it's all about the individual actions toward them. And to your thing, of course, I mean, I was at the Free Market Roadshow in Kiev in 2019, just before the presidential elections there. We were discussing all kinds of other things. I was there with you, and I would have loved to be in Kiev, obviously, today, which was the original plan to discuss the freedom variant and just discuss banalities like how governments reacted to COVID in economic sanctions. That is what we do. It was nobody's plan. The community came together and did support in all of our Free Market Roadshow areas. There was money raised, there were apartments brought together, there were medicines collected, there was that part. Of course, we feel a certain helplessness there, but we do what lies in our possibility to support Ukraine.
Julian, how you are defining the role of sanctions? Because as I mentioned before, I think this military support is right now on this higher position when we are comparing that with the sanctions. with some other forms of pressure on Russia, because from my side, I see a large evolution, even revolution. Even in Netherlands are trying to send equipment. So I think this is a very turning point when we are comparing that with the situation when Netherlands and German bloc they saw anti-drone technology before war. But do you think that sanctions are working? Do you think that's a long-term perspective to see the effectiveness of it?
Yeah, I must admit that I'm not doing research on sanctions, so I'm commenting from my perspective, be like just analyzing what I see, like talking to different people, and internally and externally. We do a lot of like international activities now with different organizations. So I do believe that sanctions matters. I do believe that we should do more, and it's not enough. I do see like the reaction internally. You know, first 2 or 3 weeks of war, we had a massive campaigns trying to reach out to Russians, just regular people, to let them stood up, go on the street, trying to tell them that if you're a million, come on, how many people live in Moscow? You will not be all arrested. But it was like 10,000 of Moscow people who went, like who stood up. We gave up this, of course. But what they really feel, the effect of sanctions, in a very basic level, that what really tries also, which also influence basic life of regular people. And even if we don't see like some like critical economic effect on some sanctions, if it could influence the understanding, the mind, like the life of regular Russian who is supporting war, because we have 82% of them supporting war now. Yes, they are brainwashed, but they should receive some intentions simply to try think like more widely. And like giving some interviews to French magazines especially, trying to explain that doing business in Russia means paying taxes in Russia, means the taxes are collected and directed to arming Russia and to killing like free civilians in Ukraine. Just, we are not talking about army things. We are talking about hospitals, theaters, more than 200 schools were like destroyed fully. So from my perspective, being not a researcher who is doing like models and analyzing the real economic effect, I see that it really works. I'm absolutely sure that it's really needed. We need more and more sanctions. I would love big companies like I mentioned before to just absolutely boycott doing business in Russia. I do believe that we should have this embargo on Russian gas. So from my perspective, that's the only way how we could, like from different perspectives, fight in this war. We need more arms, we need more sanctions, we need also financial support to win this war.
If one believes, as most of us do, or I guess all of us, in free markets and free trade, and if we believe that free markets and free trade is creating prosperity, then we also understand that being fenced off from free market and free trade is disastrous. And that is disastrous for the Russian economy today, in more levels than we tend to believe, because it has not to do with the flow of money as such. It has to do with the flow of goods and the flow of advanced production, chips, or all those things. Russia can't build missiles anymore.
Yeah, they stopped the production in their main industrial complex.
Yes. So that is not only the theoretical answer, that is the answer in reality. You can always say that sanctions in normal times have questionable achievements because they can be circumvented and they are not absolute, etc. But what we see now is that Russia is hurt by the sanctions. And there is a war going on where they kill people in Ukraine. We are not killing anyone. We are hindering them from killing ones by brutal actions. And that's, of course, we shall do. And if we believe in market economy, then we need to believe that fencing off Russia from free trade, from the global economy, and from international trade, that is a way of making it be felt for Russia. For the citizens, and that might be unfair, but for the leadership, absolutely. I enjoy myself every day when I see a jot taken into the authorities of some country somewhere. That is a small thing, but the big thing is that the Russian economy is shrinking now, and that is important.
I would like to ask more about the specific approach to these sanctions coming from India, coming from China, coming from not European states. Because in Europe, generally, we can have a kind of a consensus. Of course, I understand the Austrian policy or German policy, etc. This is the case we can discuss. But there is a number of states which are right now cooperating with, for instance, natural resources. Do you think that sanctions without that kind of a global mobilization can be effective? Are we in West so strong to use this economic pressure in this effectiveness, with this effectiveness as we want to have?
Yes, we are, and we tend to forget that. We are much stronger than we tend to believe. If you discuss the figures, the figures about economies. The US economy in the European Union accounts for more than $40 trillion in GDP, while the Chinese economy accounts for, say, $15 trillion, while the Russian economy accounts for $1.5 trillion. And that is in a time when economic strength has become much more crucial in the conflict between different systems. That's a thing we need to exercise and use, and what we are doing just now. So we need to increase the sanctions and level them up. It's a moral issue as well. But we also need to do it in a way that we are not hurting ourselves more than them. They will export gas and oil to China, fair enough, because they can't import as much anyway, and the price will fall. So that's quite good anyway. But we can secure that they are fenced off from the international market, and that's a very important thing.
It's very interesting when we are looking at this case with the drone production, and even the Chinese producer is right now abandoning this market. Of course, we can discuss is that true or false policy from one of this most known drone producer. But even the Chinese are very careful with that. When I'm reading and watching their newspapers and websites, I cannot see this great mobilization to support Russian economy, to support Russian technology. So this is, I think, a very interesting topic that I think in Western states we are not so sure about our own power when we are trying to understand this economy or military.
Yes, just see the figures. For China, we are together with the US, $40 trillion. For China, Russia is $1.5 trillion. Who would you like to trade with?
Yeah. I would like to ask you about sanctions, but with one short remark and one short additional question. Because in Belarus, we have seen a lot of sanctions before. We talk about that kind of a sanctions policy toward this Belarus government policy against their own citizens. Do you still think that sanctions are effective when we are looking at the situation with Ukraine, with this aggression against the independent state, when you have this background from your state?
So I need to give you a background. So before 2020, before the presidential elections in Belarus, there were almost no economic sanctions against the regime of Lukashenko. There were lots of personals. Sorry for that. Need to give you a background. Before 2020, before the presidential elections in Belarus, there were almost no economic sanctions against the regime. There were lots of personal sanctions or symbolic sanctions. And it started in 1996 because Lukashenko is in power since 1994, 28 years already. So before 2020, there were no economic sanctions. This is why it's impossible to say that, oh, sanctions were not working in Belarus, so why should we use them? They were not used in Belarus, economic sanctions. After 2020, opposite to what is happening right now with Russia. Sanctions were too slow and uncoordinated. So something was done by EU, something by UK, by Switzerland, by the US. Only recently, these sanctions altogether, they start accumulating. And more countries were interested in closing loopholes. Because even after announcing of some sanctions, for example, in the EU, after the case of Ryanair, after Lukashenko kidnapped an airplane to arrest one political blogger, the EU announced first sectorial sanctions against the regime. And there were certain loopholes. For example, EU agreed to ban exporting oil products, but not crude oil. So crude oil was still coming to Germany. EU sanctioned some portions of potash fertilizers, but only 20% of these, 15 to 20% of these potash fertilizers, which were coming from Belarus to the EU, not all of them. And there were lots of such loopholes. For example, that only new contracts will be forbidden, but older contracts will work. So regime was trying to sign these contracts, you know, with the previous date and so on. So lots of interesting games, and dictators are always good at it. They are much better than democracies. The exports from Belarus to the EU increased by 73% last year. Even after introducing and announcing of sectorial sanctions, the exports of oil products, crude oil, potash fertilizers, metal products, wooden products, and many other kind of stuff, they skyrocketed. So it shows that these sanctions were either insufficient or they had a lot of loopholes. And the same is going right now towards Russia. On paper, it looks very significant. And there are certain areas where these sanctions are really tough. For example, the freeze of Russian foreign reserves, it's unprecedented, and even Russian political elite was very surprised, like what's going on, how it was possible, why nobody thought about it. So it was important. The termination of any cooperation of international institutions like EBRD, European Investment Bank, World Bank, IMF, and so on, with Russia, it's also very important. And look, these two things, they do not cost European or American citizens. These things are not costly, and this is why it was easy to introduce this. When we talk about embargo on exporting to Russia or importing to Russia, these things cost. Because then European citizens need to pay more to bring, I don't know, from other countries, this oil or gas or something else. And this is why, right now, only 19% of Russian exports to the EU is sanctioned. 19%. 50%, around half of the exports from Russia, it's oil and gas, and these goods are not sanctioned. Without this, Russia is receiving more money from exporting oil and gas after the war than before the war because of increase in the prices of oil and gas. And the same happened in Belarus. This skyrocket in exports of Belarusian trade to the EU was not because sanctions boosted them, no, but because prices in global markets increased, and that was positive shock to the regime. And the same, if this sanctions will not be, there will not be special task force. And actually, right now, there is special task force. So the coordination between the US, EU, UK, and many other countries. And this is why we hear about, for example, arresting yachts or some other properties of Russian oligarchs. We hear about, for example, some kind of arrest on Abramovich's rights to control Chelsea club, and so on and so forth.
There will be no Champions League.
Yes, so it's very important to monitor the implementation of sanctions, because before the war in Ukraine, these sanctions were like they were introduced, they were announced, but nobody cared how they are really how they are really resulting. And right now, I think that politicians understand that this is important. And in EU and in the US, there are new units, new people who are responsible for this.
Well, I perfectly agree, and I agree with both of you. But there is a real quantitative difference between sanctions aimed at somebody who potentially stole an election or got reelected with that. I mean, we heard the same kind of claims from the US, sorry to do that, or to stop an aggressive fighting war. Sanctions are not generally, by the Western world, economic sanctions are not done for regime change. I mean, the first sanctions in my lifetime were against Cuba for nationalizing Western things. We've had sanctions against Iran. We've had sanctions against South Africa. Those work to a certain extent. But the sanctions were not intended, and as a general rule, did not achieve regime change in those countries, because you're not doing a sanction because you don't like whoever was elected or potentially not elected in that country. It is very difficult to dislodge a dictator in the country without the support of the people in that country itself. I mean, unless you march in militarily and dispose that dictator, which has happened at times, but you can't dispose the dictator without the help of the local population, as happened in Ukraine. So the sanctions that we have now, and the reason that they are so strong, are for the unfortunate reason that we have a shooting war and an invasion, and everybody agrees that this invasion, as such, is wrong, and it's a war, contrary to what the other side says. So that is just the difference that, unfortunately, I have to make on the whole sanction thing. Should these sanctions be stronger and should they work? We don't really have a comparison. I mean, the dictatorship in North Korea is still there, despite the absolute strongest sanctions.
We have a new missiles presented on their march.
In there, but I mean, they happen to have. There is a quantitative difference between somebody that has an atomic bomb and somebody that doesn't. Even if we're afraid, it's a lot easier to sanction somebody that doesn't have an atomic bomb. Sorry, may sound cynical, but that's the way it is. The main weapon that we have is A, economic, B, technological, because we have the advantage there. This war is not only being fought there, it was also by data, by hackers, by publicizing the text messages between in the Russian army, etc., etc. Those things are where we have a major advantage. And what would definitely hurt the regime in Russia is if we had a much better economy and we brought the price of oil back down to 30, because that would really hurt him. Because as you said, if the price of oil is up because of it, then whomever he sells it to, whether it's us or somebody else, he's making a lot more money. But alone in the last 3 years, we've had the price of oil below $30 and above 180. The best way is for free markets to reduce the cost of energy. Some things have happened. The changes within the EU to suspend some of the laws that happened in the German Green Deal, to continue to allow the operation of coal-fired power plants, to continue to allow the operation of atomic power plants, I would not have believed a few months ago that the EU could change their entire energy policy in such an extreme way. So something is happening there. But still, the best way from a free market standpoint, of course, would be for technology and so on to make us independent of all of this and therefore hurt them in their capacity to make money to spend.
I think I will agree with you that in the long term, this is it's an optimal, ideal way of dealing with this. But in, for example, Ukraine right now and Belarus 2 years ago needed much faster response, and just positive agenda cannot solve this problem.
But do you afraid to have some negative feedback on Belarus society after this wave of sanctions against Russian Belarus? Because I can give you an example from my second work. I'm working as an academic teacher, and I'm talking with students in Poland. They are studying they escaped from this regime because of their political background, and they are right now having a problem with banking accounts, with some financial and banking, electronic banking structures. Do you think that these sanctions on Russia will put a pressure on Belarus society?
Oh, this is definitely, because right now these sanctions are hurting the sponsor, the only sponsor of the Belarusian regime. I believe that if Russia did not support Lukashenko after the rigged presidential elections in 2020, he will not stay in power, because many people inside the political, military and other elites, business elites in Belarus, they were hesitating what to do. And once they heard that Putin said that we will support Lukashenko, Lukashenko is legitimate president, and we are preparing national, it's not army, I don't know don't remember how to call it in English, that national armed forces to stay on the border between Russia and Belarus, just in case if somebody in Belarus will start protesting violently, and then Russia will use this army to protect Lukashenko's regime.
Also 20,000 of troops there.
Something like this, yes. So Russia is the last and the only sponsor of the Belarusian regime. Without weak Russia or democratization inside Russia, I think it's impossible for democratization in Belarus, because we see it right now how Russia behaves in Ukraine. Even if we managed to somehow deal with Lukashenko and changed his regime, probably we'll experience Russian army.
Perhaps for the conclusion, I would like to ask you briefly about European Union approach to this war. Do you think that European Union is playing a vital role, or it's only a kind of false flag operation, even when we are looking at this long debate without endings, or perhaps European Union can right now redefine the role in this European policy?
I think that is exactly what has happened. There's a saying that the operation was successful, but the patient died. I think that we need to understand that free markets are mostly a long-term perspective. They are extremely efficient on the short-term perspective as well. But new technologies, they emerge for a long time. And in 100 years' time, we will have solar energy, etc. We'll maybe walk into museums to see petrol. But that doesn't help us now. So we need to do a lot of things, and some of those things need to be dealt with regulations and legislation. And some other things are using the freedom of markets. That is the case just now. But what has happened in European Union, that it has taken a lot of actions, and that has been very clear regarding Russia. For quite a long time, there was a hope among a lot of member states that you could be a partner with Russia. I remember that because I was in European Parliament at that time, and I fought that idea together with a lot of East Europeans. It was ridiculous. It was some sort of hope. That hope does more or less not exist anymore. I mean, you can find people who say that we shouldn't go that far, etc. But mainly, this is the stance, and I think that's good. And then we are understanding that we need to make the alliances with US, and US with us, but also with other parts. I think it was quite interesting to listen to the speech from Ursula von der Leyen in India, which is a way of stretching out. India has been very indifferent, to put it mildly, in this process. Yes, yes, yes. But
from the other hand, I need to underline right now, India are trying to abandon some helicopter contracts with Russia, and they are cutting some ties with even Russian arms production. So, of course, they are buying a very cheap resources, but at the same time, there are some small pieces of actions inside India to cut this cooperation, military cooperation. I'm looking at the military technology. This is very interesting.
Yes, but still, we are dealing with that, and I think we have. It has put a momentum in decision making, but also to sort out what are the priorities, what are the most important things, and that are the global things to be a geopolitical force. It has reinforced the discussion about how to strengthen European military capacity, which is extremely important.
Yeah, I mean, we hoped when the Iron Curtain came down, when the Soviet Union was dissolved, we hoped, all of us, that free markets and more trade and all of this happened would soften and would lead to regime change in China and in Russia. And for a while there, for 10 years or so, we thought, okay, this is what's working. But then different forms in China and in Russia, in some other countries, of policies came up that were dangerous, and then you had the warnings. And of course, inside the EU, there was always the Eastern European EU members warning about Russia, and some of those warnings were not heard in the rest of the world. And then there were other priorities, the Green Deal and consolidating the European Union and all of those things that didn't happen. There were even, I mean, every country in the European Union is taking the European Union to court on some issue of law, and there's Poland, and there's Austria, and there's Germany fighting the various things. So what do we want? Do we want the original discussion? Do we want a federal state or those long-term goals of the European Union? But now I think this has really shown that the Eastern European countries together were right to warn of it. But now there are other differences in the world. China is a major power. It is also a change that you have to watch out for. The Indians voted neutral because, you know, they've got China on their border, and they happen to be getting a lot of weapons from Russia. I mean, from their point of view, it's unfortunately understandable. So you can't see any of these actions happening individually. It has to happen by cooperation among us. If I was talking only about the COVID variant, I'm saying, okay, all these supply chain issues will lead to, more business, more industry coming back from Asia to Europe, and that would be good for Eastern European economies. That's the topic we all had prepared, because we are, unfortunately, better at talking about economics than talking about war. Very sad.
Absolutely, yeah. I do believe that 24th of February was a wake-up call for Europe, finally, and for the world. Many events happened, we reminded all of them before, which were not enough simply to understand the whole threat and the whole, factor of Putin, Russia, and the country. I do believe it's not about one man. It's about society who supported them. That's why it's important to also understand that there are people who are supporting the regime. But I am optimistic. And we are working on a plans how we will rebuild Ukraine. And we will rebuild. And we will prevail. Truth will prevail. We will fight evil. Now it's a matter of time and the price. And the price is very high already paid for this victory, for these values. So that's why I'm also here to talk to all of you and asking all of you to stand with us, help us. We feel this help. We really appreciate it in human level, in organizational level, in bringing humanitarian aid. It's so important to feel this unity. And I think the unity of Europe is incredible now. And even if might be some political issues and some speeches which are quite ridiculous, like me staying in Vienna, I met such a supporting people, such a big support from Barbara, Brit, and all other colleagues. So my big request is just to stand with us, to understand that we are fighting for values, for freedom and dignity, which is for our community a core value, I believe, and we are ready to prove it by actions as we are in Ukraine, we are dying for those values. So I do believe that Europe had a great now momentum, chance to become much stronger, to take leadership, redefined or defined. It was really very nicely said. Thank you.
Thank you.
And short comment from my side, I think that the efficient basket of instruments against such regimes as Lukashenko's or Putin's should include not only sanctions, but coordinations. And coordinations not only inside the Western world, which is much easier to do, but coordinations with countries that are either neutral or supportive, like in certain ways, maybe China, maybe India, maybe some other countries. In case of Belarus, before war, it was unfortunately also Ukraine, for example, via which Ukraine was the second largest trade partners, and Lukashenko's regime was trying to change some routes instead of Baltic ports to Ukrainian ports. So economic sanction coordinations between different countries. And third one is carrots. Not only sticks, not only a negative agenda, but also positive agenda. In case of Ukraine, it is kind of Marshall Plan or some other international aid plan to rebuild the economy. In case of Belarus, it might be trade liberalization after Belarus is democratic, maybe visa-free regime to the EU. In case of Russia, I don't know, should be something else. Because if there is only negative agenda, then we can be trapped with the cases North Korea or Cuba. So it should always be some sort of exit for any country, even such evil regime as Putin's regime right now.
Thank you very much. We are out of time, I think, yeah?
May I make very short?
Very shortly.
Yes. First of all, this is a formative time. I think we have been waking up, but not only the morning on the 24th. Then we did wake up a little bit more when we saw what we could do. And then we woke up a little bit more, impressed by it had a meaning. This is a process of waking up that I think is important. Second thing is, don't throw overboard the idea of that free trade contributes to democracy and freedom. I do think it does. And I think what we see now is exactly a long-term perspective on that, because the reason why Mr. Xi is afraid and strengthening the repression is because he sees what free economy is doing to his society. And the same thing for Putin. They got afraid. And then that's a striking back. Third issue, we need to win this war. We need to mobilize as much as possible to help citizens of Ukraine and Belarus to win these wars, because otherwise we will be the losers. Russia needs to be the loser. And we need to do that. And then we will have other problems. We will have problems with Russia. We will have problems with Belarus and Ukraine. I think we need to offer them a membership in the steps that is possible and accessible. But then we need to deal with those problems and not be surprised at that time.
And the last remark.
I'll switch roles from the panel and put on my hat as board member of the Austrian Economic Center and co-organizer of the Free Market Roadshow, and want to thank the Warsaw Enterprise Institute for making this possible, that we could still hold the Kiev Free Market Roadshow here. I would have very much loved to be in Kiev today, as I was in 2019. All of the free market think tanks involved in the Free Market Roadshow have tried strongly to support and spread the message and work not only for free markets, but for individual freedoms and hopefully for the freedom of Ukraine. We do this in 40 cities all over Europe every year in the spring, and we want to bring people together. Every time I learn something about what is going on in other parts of the world, and I truly believe that only learning more about other peoples and how they think and what is going on in the individual countries will truly lead to freedom. So thank you all very much for attending, and thank you all for organizing.
Thank you very much.